Hello everyone, my name is Brady Mahan and I will be doing a presentation on slave labor to paid work, and I will be using excerpts from The Refugee by Benjamin Drew, and I will also be using excerpts from a few other scholarly sources that will be linked to in the end notes. First, I would like to bring up two key terms that are important for this presentation. The first is, what is a slave state? Now, the Oxford English Dictionary does have a direct example of this, and it is one or other of the southern United States of America in which slaveholding was legal. It was also seen as normal and okay by the people living in the southern United States. And the ones that do come up are Mississippi, South Carolina, and Tennessee the most in the readings that we have done. And the second definition is, what is slave labor? While the Oxford English Dictionary does not have a direct quote, it is essentially where a person who is owned and stripped of freedom is made to work for the benefit of the owner/owners. Essentially, it was free work, which down in the southern United States at the time was seen as, again, normal and okay. Now, what exactly was slave labor in a slave state? Slave labor was little to no pay, almost negative pay, if you will. It was a slave being indebted to their owner or master as if repaying a debt owed, being it their parents or whoever had sold them off also had a debt to pay. Now, these debts would come as slates that were filled and needed to be wiped clean. It was very rare, very, very rare that these slates were ever wiped clean. Often the slates would end up being even more filled. Now, there was also high weekly quotas of corn, rice, cotton, wheat, what say you? But usually at the end of these weeks, it was hundreds of pounds, sacks and sacks full of these goods. And if this high weekly quota was not met, punishments would be doled out. One of the most popular punishments was whipping. There were some things in slave labor in slave states that were allowed. These allowances would come in the form of food per month and clothing per year. One such example comes from Edward Patterson on page 126 in The Refugee, where he's quoted saying, 2 pairs of pantaloons and 2 shirts in the summer. In the fall, 1 pair of shoes, 1 pair of pantaloons, and 1 pair of stockings. Everything else was to be bought outside of, and usually that came from the meager amount of pay that some slaves would get. What exactly were labor laws in these slave states? There were none. The labor laws did not exist. They were slave laws. According to Rose E. Vaughn in an article called Black Codes, according to the South Carolina laws, Item 1 states, the slave was a chattel and must be treated thus. He may be, as an example, seized for a debt. Now this would directly clash with the Tennessee slave laws, where Tennessee states in 1857 that a slave was not chattel, a slave was a person. They had their own wants and needs. However, that did not exactly work on Tennessee plantations, and they were still seen as property. Then there is the change from the slave labor of the slave states to the Canadian labor in Canada. As far as we know, and within our readings, there was little to no punishment involving physicality within Canada labor. Slaves were no longer slaves, they were people, they were financially free. And the switch of just culture goes from being a slave and having nothing to being able to purchase things and being able to live. According to John Warren on page 178 and 179 of The Refugee, he is quoted, "I came here to work and expect to work. Time goes smoother with me than it did. 1 month there seemed longer than 2 do now." This is in reference to his work down in these states, mostly in Mississippi, where he was made to work as a slave, whereas up here he now had wages and could work whatever job he could get, or wanted for that matter. However, there were issues within Canadian labor. If you were a runaway slave, potentially you could be caught in Canada and dragged all the way back to your master for punishment. One such thing almost happened to Patrick Snade on page 110 and 111, where he runs into constables at his job in Canada. This is, of course, in The Refugee. There was also the fact that although they were paid, it was not exactly a large wage, such as British and French white Europeans. And then there was also the fact that it didn't exactly feel like home. It was colder, the culture was different, you didn't have your family surrounding you or the found family that you created. And it was the whole idea of you were no longer a servant. You were your own self. What exactly could you do for yourself? The possibilities, while not endless, were far vast. This concludes my presentation on slave labor to paid work. Thank you for listening.